Hello, this is Lucy Morgan, and we're here to talk about implementing the new grant regulations. In our first module, we're going to talk about what is changing with the new grant regulations. So what is happening? Everyone wants to know why we've made this change and what specifically is changing with the new grant regulations. So we're going to go through the top 10 changes to the grant regulations that have happened as part of this shift to the OMB Super Circular. Well, let's start with the first one, which of course is the most important, and that's the movement from our old grant regulations to 2 CFR Part 200, the Uniform Administrative Requirements, Cost Principles, and Audit Requirements for Federal Awards. Now that's a mouthful, so sometimes it's referred to as this OMB Super Circular, and that is the first big change to the grant regulations, since I wore great big glasses that looked like a windshield over a decade ago. The second part of the grant regulations that I wanted to draw your attention to is the new risk assessment. This is a new requirement that is going to be instituted both on the federal agency level and also for pass-through entities. And what this new requirement does is it seeks to limit the risk to the federal government by strengthening oversight of grant awardees. The desire is that it will improve the grant outcomes and ensure financial integrity of taxpayer funds and how they're spent. Now, it does allow a little bit of administrative flexibility. There's not a master rule book that tells you everything you need to know to assess risk on a subawardee or an awardee for that matter, but it does create a framework which will be included in the Notice of Funding Opportunity. Now, the big thing I want to remind everyone is that this new requirement also applies to pass-through entities. So if you receive an award and you are passing through some of those federal dollars to subawardees, you need to remember that this new risk assessment must be done prior to awarding any work. The third area I wanted to talk about was the new certification of costs. Now, this is something that some institutions of higher education may be familiar with. There was a version of this for them, but for those of you in local governments, nonprofits, you may not be as familiar. And what this is it is a new certification that is required that expenditures are proper and consistent with award terms and conditions. Now, one of the big things in this is that omission of material facts is also considered a violation, and that's something new in the new guidance. Another thing is that they are specifically saying who must sign the certification. It used to be a responsible official. Now it must be signed by an official who is authorized to legally bind the organization. So it may be a little higher up the food chain than what you've seen in the past. And this can be quite a shock to different people who may not have signed some of these certifications before. The new certification is going to be included in fiscal reports or vouchers requesting payment under the agreements. All of those must include this new certification. The fourth area that I want to highlight in the new grant regulations are the indirect cost rates. Now, the first one has to do with a trend that we've been seeing over many years where the federal government has been working to decrease the indirect cost rates so that they can put more emphasis on how the funds are directly being spent. So what they've instituted with the new grant regulations is a new 10% de minimis indirect cost rate. Now, this is a really good deal if you are someone that would qualify for it. Unfortunately, they're not extending that to organizations that have had negotiated cost rates in place in the past. So this is only for non-federal entities that have never had a negotiated cost rate in place. But if you're a new organization, it may be really something worth checking out. And once this is in place, you can elect to use this rate indefinitely. So if 10% sounds pretty good to you, this is going to be a real nice feature. The other thing that they've done is for those of you who have negotiated cost rates in place, they're allowing a one-time extension without further negotiation for up to 4 years, subject to review and approval of the cognizant agency. So this again is going to allow a little bit of time. Sometimes the whole negotiation process has been a bit of a bear in the past, so this is designed to make it easier to keep those indirect cost rates in place, provided they are of a level that the federal government is finding reasonable. The fifth area that I want to highlight is the new threshold for the Single Audit Act. Now, most of us are familiar with audits being called A133 audits. And the first thing you have to realize is that the new grant guidance is going to include the audit regulations, and so the A133 reference is going to be obsolete. Instead, it is having to do with the Single Audit Act, and it is going to be part of the new circular, the OMB Super Circular. So that single audit threshold is being raised to $750,000 in federal spending. The federal government felt that this was a way to minimize some of the administrative burden for approximately 5,000 organizations who fell in the 500 to 750 range. And it still is covering 99% of all federal dollars that are awarded. So it seemed like a win-win for some smaller organizations to not have to have that Single Audit Act audit, which can be expensive and time-consuming, but still protect the taxpayers by covering the larger awards through the Single Audit Act. So that's just something to be aware of. Now, one thing I do want to mention, unfortunately, if you are in that in-between place, there is no early implementation. So if this year you qualify for the Single Audit Act because you are over 500,000, then you still need to go through that process. But next year, if you are still in that range, you may not need to have that Single Audit Act done. The sixth area I want to highlight is having to do with conflicts of interest. Now, it came as a bit of a surprise to me that some federal agencies didn't have policies on conflicts of interest. But as part of the new OMB Super Circular, they have stated that all federal agencies must have policies on conflicts of interest. So that was good. I was surprised, like I said, that they didn't have them. But the other thing it's done is it's expanded the conflict of interest requirements for non-federal entities. Now, once again, non-federal entities are pretty much anybody who's not a federal agency. So in the old guidance, we had separate guidance for nonprofit organizations, separate guidance for institutions of higher learning and governmental units. Now, all of those are considered non-federal entity. And the conflicts of interest requirements are that you must disclose in writing any potential conflict of interest. You have to actually disclose this to the federal awarding agency or the pass-through entity. So no more waiting for them to find it. If you know about it, you must disclose. And that is a change with the new grant guidance. Number 7, violations of law. This again is some new guidance in the OMB Super Circular, and it states that non-federal entities must disclose in a timely manner and in writing to the federal awarding agency or the pass-through entity all violations of federal criminal law involving fraud, bribery, gratuity violations that potentially affect the federal award. So once again, we're shifting from that view of we'll see if the auditors find it to if it happens, it must be disclosed. So it's putting a higher level of burden and transparency on non-federal entities to disclose when violations happen. Number 8, this is part of a policy requirement that seeks to promote women in the science and technology fields. And this was something that the COFAR spent a bunch of time talking about, really what can we do to make things better for women in science and technology, really all the STEM fields. And so what they came up with is to support family-friendly policies. This is something that may happen through your employee policies and your employee handbook. They also were seeking to balance work and family responsibilities. In the past, they may have researchers that felt like they couldn't travel to conferences because of family responsibilities, things like that. So they're looking to try and make that more of a balance so that more women can participate in research. And specifically, they've targeted travel and conference costs as a way to do that. And we'll get into that a little bit more in a later module. Number 9, the grant regulations have caught up with the fact that much of the information that we have about ourselves is now online. And so number 9 has to do with protected personally identifiable information. Personally identifiable information includes many different types of information, but there is now a requirement that non-federal entities take reasonable measures to safeguard that type of information and also other forms of sensitive information. What we're going to see in the coming years is more and more information about the grantees, things about their grants and the people participating in those awards is going to be captured in various databases. So the federal government is getting out in front of it, at least right now, to make sure that you have processes in place that are going to protect that information. And in fact, there will be a statement when you file reports that the statements don't contain protected personally identifiable information. And now we have number 10, and that has to do with internal controls. In the past, internal controls have been relegated to the A133 audit requirements and thought by many people to be more of a finance or accounting type of function. What's happened is the federal government wants to make internal controls a bigger part of what's going on throughout the whole spending process and the grant management cycle. So internal controls you'll now find are sprinkled throughout the new grant guidance. And it's moving those A133 audit requirements into the grant life cycle from start to finish. You now find them in the administrative requirements, and there is now a requirement to provide reasonable assurance that your organization has internal controls functioning as expected. This is going to be a big focused area of both auditors and the federal agencies. So just a heads up, people need to know about what are good internal controls and how do we make sure we have them at our organization. So that was our quick walkthrough on the 10 big changes in the new grant guidance. And I just want to give you a little preview of our next video, which is talking about when do the grant regulations have to be implemented. So stay tuned and just go ahead and click on to the next video and we'll talk about our next topic.